What are the lessons from CO2 pricing mechanisms in the world? Can we raise the price of carbon and avoid carbon leakage? What is the right price for CO2? This session looks at how to achieve carbon neutrality within the next few decades.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back after that very, very short break to a session that has become something of a perennial topic here at the BETD, carbon pricing. And as we heard just now in our Game On panel, John Kerry talked about it as one of the most crucial drivers of the green energy transition. Carbon pricing is often seen as the lever of choice when it comes to steering investment toward renewables and away from fossil fuels. So why is it that carbon pricing remains, in the words of Financial Times columnist Martin Wolf, a good idea whose time has not yet come? Our title here is Don't Think Twice, Set a Carbon Price. And in fact, more than 40 countries in the world have done that to date in introducing either a carbon tax or an emissions trading scheme. And yet, the great majority of these set an emission price that is simply too low to propel us to carbon neutrality in the near future. So the fact is, policymakers face a dilemma. Effectively raising the price of carbon higher could spark carbon leakage, a relocation of emitting activities, meaning also jobs, to other regions with more lenient legislation. What do we do about that? What are the lessons learned from CO2 pricing mechanisms across the world? Which measures can actually serve to achieve carbon neutrality within the next decades? Those are the issues we want to explore in this panel. We've got a great selection of speakers. We also are very eager to hear from you, ladies and gentlemen, both via our chat mechanism. If you're a registered user, please send us your questions. And also, we've got some live polling that we want to do in this session. And perhaps you're already voting on our first audience question. It is this: in your opinion, what is the right price of carbon per ton? And we have, at the moment, votes coming in showing a clear majority at the moment. Well, actually not a clear majority. The largest share says above 100 euros per ton. Next largest share sees it at 50 to 100 euros a ton. Slightly lower share, about a quarter of you are saying above 200 euros a ton. And then we have a very, very small share saying somewhere between 10 euros and 50 euros. So we'll give that some more time to play out while I now introduce our panelists. And again, I'm going to keep the intros brief in the interest of maximizing time for discussion. It's a pleasure to welcome Simonetta Sommaruga. She is member of Switzerland's Federal Council and head of the Swiss Federal Department of Environment, Transport, Energy, and Communications. Also very glad to have with us Pekka Haavisto. He is Finland's Minister for Foreign Affairs. Great to see you, sir. Sabine Frank is with us. She is Executive Director of Carbon Market Watch. Thank you so much for being with us today. And Wendy Hughes is Manager of Carbon Markets and Innovation Practice at the World Bank, leading teams working on carbon markets and also overseeing the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. So if we can, dear technicians, I'd like to go back to that word cloud one more time. To our audience poll to see where we came out. Okay, very interesting. So we've got equal shares. 31% of our voters said 50 to 100 euros. Another 31% said above 100 euros. Just 20% want to see us go really ambitious, above 200 euros. And then we've got about 18% seeing the right carbon price as somewhere below 50 euros. So now let us hear from the panel. And I'd like to start out by asking each of the policymakers to talk about your own country's approach. And I'm just going to remind you, because as always, we're very tight on time, I'd be very grateful if you can keep this initial statement to 3 minutes or less. So I'll start with Federal Councillor Sommaruga. What are the main features of the current carbon tax in Switzerland? And in particular, tell us the secret to your success in instituting a CO2 tax that is in fact among the highest in the world and does include a tax on airline tickets and an increase in the price of fuel. What can other countries learn from you?
Thank you so much for this question, dear ministers, dear colleagues, ladies and gentlemen. Well, I can tell you that Switzerland introduced a CO2 tax on heating fuels, so not on transport fuels, already in 2008. This CO2 tax has 3 main features. The first is the tax rate is automatically adjusted if emissions reductions are not on track. Because we missed some intermediate targets, the rate increased from about 11 euro per ton at the beginning to 87 euro now. Second feature, 2/3 of the revenue from the tax is refunded to the population on a per capita basis and to the enterprises. 1/3 of the revenues, this is maximum 400 million euro per year, is used for a program to renovate buildings because buildings have a large emissions reduction potential. To make people accept the tax, it was important that the revenue would not go to the general state budget. So with the refunding per capita, this solution is also socially acceptable. And the third feature is that large industries are in the Swiss emissions trading system, which is linked to the EU ETS, and they are exempted from the tax. For smaller enterprises, we have a carrot and stick approach. The carrot is that they are exempted from the tax if they reduce their emissions substantially and in a way that can be verified. The stick is that they pay a fine if they don't reduce their emissions. Well, last year our parliament revised the CO2 law. There will be a referendum next June. That means that people, our population, will have the last word on this legislation, and we will have to convince our population about this revised CO2 law. So this revised CO2 law foresees that first the CO2 tax on heating fuels may be increased to 190 euro per ton if emissions are not reduced enough. So we are now close to the 200 euro per ton. Then a larger share of transport emissions will need to be compensated. The revised law allows for that share to increase from 12% at present to up to 90%. To finance compensation projects, up to Swiss cent liter of gasoline will be up to 12 Swiss cent liter of gasoline. That means 10 euro cent will be charged compared to 1.5 cent at the moment. This will be equivalent to some 50 euro per ton of CO2. Then, second point, we will introduce an aviation tax of 25 to 110 euro per flight ticket. We will also tax private aviation. Like for the CO2 tax, at least half of the aviation tax revenue will be refunded to the population. CO2 and aviation tax revenues, which are not refunded, will go to a new climate fund with up to 1 billion euro each year. This fund can be seen as our green recovery package. So my message to close to countries which consider introducing a CO2 price, first point, do it progressively to allow for people and the economy to adapt. Second point, be transparent about the use of revenues, refund part of revenues if necessary with a social component, allocate part of revenues to sustainability projects. Third point, give enterprises a chance to be exempted if they reduce emissions sufficiently. And fourth point, we have to admit it, The transport sector and car drivers are a very strong lobby. Charge them a CO2 price which is politically feasible, but make them understand that long term they will have to pay a price which fully internalizes costs. So please help us to win our referendum in June. We will do everything to have our population convinced, and thank you for your attention.
Your messages are so clear. It seems like you have pretty good chances of winning that referendum yourself. Let me go on now to Minister Haavisto and ask you to talk a little bit about what your country's doing, because in fact in 1990 Finland became one of the very first countries to price CO2 emissions through a carbon tax. So maybe you can tell us where your price level is now in terms of that audience poll that we posed a little bit earlier, and also tell us a little bit about the impact that the tax has had over this pretty long period of time, 30 years. What lessons would you want to convey to other countries thinking about doing this?
Thank you, Madam Chair. And first, thanking, of course, the Berlin Energy Transition Dialogue for organizing this very important debate, because through dialogue and international cooperation, we can maybe have an equal high green tax level globally and first in Europe. And of course, we are following very closely the Energiewende and its 10th anniversary year in Germany. In many ways, of course, German debate has shown the model to others. Currently, I just want to advertise a little bit that we have also established together with Chile a network of coalition of finance ministers for climate action. Actually, we have now 52 finance ministers in this network, because we think that the fiscal and economic policymakers should also be interested on green taxes and carbon taxes and discuss these issues, not only leave it to the ministers of environment, these topics. And as you mentioned, Finland was the first country in the world to pass a carbon tax, and we started taxing fossil fuel for environmental purposes in 1990. We have a long experience of carbon pricing, especially in transport and energy sectors, and in both sectors, carbon pricing in the form of taxes and emission trading have effectively led to emissions reductions in Finland. Cars in Finland have been taxed on the basis of the CO2 emissions since 2008. Carbon pricing, we think, has proved to be a cost-effective measure to reduce emissions, and it provides flexibility for those targeted by the pricing mechanism. 2015, we had a new Finnish law on climate change, which is actually requires cutting greenhouse gas emissions by 80%. And when this government was formed 2019, we decided that Finland will be the first carbon neutral country by 2035. And of course, we are quite close, so we really have to run for that target. How emissions have been cut in Finland? Actually, we have cut almost 30% from our 1990 level. This has not had negative effects on the development of the Finnish economy, which was the main argument sometimes when people argued against this kind of taxation. And of course, we have our northern location, we have our long distances in the country, and all these issues. This country is an energy-intensive country. For that purpose, I think our goal is what we have achieved is quite good. And maybe a couple of remarks. We have more and more municipalities that have their own carbon programs now for the carbon neutrality, which is important. The youth is mobilizing itself on these issues. And what is the best? Actually, our businesses and our industries have formed a climate leadership coalition, and they are lobbying also globally in their counterparts the climate issue. And I think this role of the industry and private sector is very, very important in Finland. And change, of course, has to be just, and costs have to be distributed evenly, and carbon pricing is one of the mechanisms for distributing cost in a fair way in our regard. And finally, I would like to mention the European Union's Green Recovery Package. We just discussed that yesterday, today in the Finnish Parliament, and we are actually steering more than or 50% of those recovery package funds to climate issues, we are counting that we can reduce 6% further our climate impact with this recovery package. So this can also be used for climate purposes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Pekka Haavisto. And let me go now to Sabine Frank. Your work focuses, among other topics, on the analysis of developments in international carbon markets. So it would be helpful if you could maybe tell us some of your key findings on carbon pricing. And then I also have an audience question that I'd like to bring in after that initial take from you.
Yes, thank you. Here we're jumping quite a bit away from national carbon pricing. International carbon markets follow a very different price logic. The logic here is to obtain the cheapest abatement options. So it's the pursuit of cheap carbon prices. It's a very different logic to those of carbon taxes or of cap and trade systems, where the idea is to get to prices which hurt emitters and therefore provide incentives to them to reduce their emissions. Consider that in the international carbon market, for example, where companies voluntarily buy carbon credits, the price of one carbon ton is still below $8, so a far cry from some of the wishes for carbon prices that we saw earlier in the poll. And neither are international carbon markets actually about reducing emissions as such. Rather they serve polluting countries and companies to offset some of their emissions by buying credits for emissions which are avoided, reduced, or removed elsewhere. And the challenge for those markets and for the UN climate conference in November is to finally agree on the rules for them and to avoid all the loopholes that might arise, such as the carryover of excessively old credits or the danger of double counting of emission reductions. And a challenge for the voluntary carbon market, which is growing because more and more companies adopt net zero goals and look to buy offsets. The challenge there is to ensure that these carbon credits, the offsets, are only used on the back of serious efforts to reduce own emissions, and also that carbon credits truly represent emission reductions or removals, and that other desirable benefits are created, such as climate finance for developing countries.
Thank you very much. And just a quick follow-up question. Can carbon pricing instruments work without offsetting mechanisms? And if so, or what alternatives do you see to offsetting mechanisms?
Yeah, carbon pricing mechanisms should in fact work without offsets, because offsets always serve the purpose of taking away the burden on emitting entities. In an ETS, in an emissions trading system, offsets are always also risky, because you exchange a real emission reductions for a credit which might or might not represent a real reduction. So you're just increasing the uncertainty. And under a carbon tax system, offsets effectively lower the incentive to decarbonize, because you can buy a cheap credit instead of paying the tax, and therefore they would also lower public revenues. Now, as to the alternatives, it always has to be emphasized that the first and foremost commandment is to reduce emissions. And then only once currently unabatable emissions are honestly established, can carbon credits be purchased to make amends. But from our point of view, it's important that this is not done on a strict ton-for-ton compensation logic, which leads to a net zero claim, because this is most often prone to inaccuracies in the quantifications, and therefore can be deceptive. What we see as an alternative is that companies in particular just make climate contribution claims when they buy carbon credits. And such practices should always be underpinned by absolute emission reduction aims with credible implementation strategies.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much to Sabine Frank. And let me go now to Wendy Hughes at the World Bank to talk a bit about your own findings and about the work of the Carbon Pricing Leadership Commission. So first of all, what aspects or what mechanisms of carbon pricing do you see as most effective and most feasible?
Hi, nice to have this opportunity. So just first of all, to thank the organizers for including the World Bank. I'm sure most people are aware, but our clients and our counterparts are developing countries around the world, including the least developing countries right through to middle income countries. So the perspective coming from the World Bank is in that context. We have, at the World Bank, we work on the carbon pricing agenda in a range of different ways. We have been supporting countries on carbon tax, emissions trading systems and crediting, shadow pricing, fossil fuel subsidy reform. And in terms of what is most effective, it really depends on the context. I think that's maybe the main takeaway that I would like to put forward. In many of the countries where we work, it is very, very critical to look at the distributional effects of carbon pricing to make sure that the poorest segments of society are not negatively affected. It's also very important to understand the broader development benefits that a carbon price can bring, including freeing up resources that may be used for inefficient subsidies that could then be redirected to health or education. It can also contribute to incentives to lower air pollution. So there's a range of other development benefits which are very critical and can be moved forward by putting in place carbon pricing mechanisms. And finally, I think another very important aspect to consider is that carbon pricing never happens in a vacuum. It is always in the context of other policies and in particular other sector policies. And so understanding what the policy and regulatory framework is when you're introducing a carbon price of some sort is very critical to make sure that the pricing mechanism has the impact that policymakers are anticipating. Just to mention, you mentioned the World Bank support for the Carbon Pricing Leadership Coalition. We see that as a very important avenue for sharing experience and raising the profile and the voices and advocacy from leadership on carbon pricing. The World Bank plays the role of a secretariat. It's a voluntary group which comprises senior members from governments around the world, a chief executive office and other senior members from industry, as well as civil society representation. We also, from the World Bank side, have a number of other very, I think, impactful programs. We are just wrapping up a program that lasted for 10 years called the Program for Market Readiness, which supported at least 20 countries in exploring and preparing to implement carbon pricing, ranging from emissions trading systems, crediting, and also carbon taxes. And we've just recently launched the Program for Market Implementation, which also will support an additional set of countries to move forward to implementing carbon pricing. I think, let me stop there. That perhaps covers it.
Thank you. Thank you very much to you. Perhaps just one audience question to you, Wendy Hughes, if you would, because you do have, I think, a fairly broad picture of developments. And the audience member asks this: if every country picks and chooses what activities are taxed or have a carbon price and which ones are exempt, how can the world achieve its goals? So in some ways, this is a question about the need for uniform approaches. What would you say to that?
I would say it is just unavoidable that different countries will be able to implement and use effectively different mechanisms. The level of income is different. The resources, the structure of the economies are so different that it is just absolutely impossible to say that there's one way to tackle this problem from a carbon pricing point of view. I think that's true of almost anything in the development space. Solutions that are not customized to the context in which they are supposed to be implemented often face a lot of challenges. So the trick is to really learn from what is working in other parts of the world, and then take the time and work with stakeholders to really understand how those kind of lessons can be used to build something that will work in the particular context. It doesn't mean that the end goal can't be achieved, but the approach of trying to implement the same set of policies or regulations, regardless of the situation, I think is just unlikely to succeed. So taking the time to work through what is going to be effective in a particular country, including given the existing policies, is really necessary and I think can be effective.
Thank you very much. And let me go back now to our two national policymakers on the panel, both of them, of course, from affluent countries, it must be said. When you talk about carbon pricing, would you say that there are ways to make this, I guess really it's coming back to the question of graduated approaches and benchmarking that Councillor Sommaruga talked about, but how do you try to bring people along on this journey? So back to you, Councillor, perhaps for a word or two, and also looking ahead to that referendum, what are you going to be telling people?
Well, first, I think we have to have the sensitivity and the consciousness that this climate change and this climate crisis is something which is, we have to do it together. I listened before to John Kerry, and I think when we listen to him and what he wants to do together with all the other countries, then this gives also a lot of energy to go on. Second point, I think in our country, what was very important is that, as I mentioned, we had this carbon tax only on the heating fuels, and we give 2/3 back to the population on a per capita. So that means that for families, for example, if they have a heating and there are 2 children or 3 children and the parents, so they get back quite a lot of money, and at the same time they are invited to, for example, change their heating system. And when they change their heating system to a fossil-free heating, and at the same time they get back something from the tax. So for them, it's really a good situation. I think we can show people that it's socially also effective, because people with low income, they get back money and they can change something. So it's on the one hand an invitation to change something, to go to a fossil-free energy, and on the other hand, you get back some money. And with the 1/3 from the revenues we keep, so we do not just take it as a revenue for the state budget, but we show that we have programs to have a changement in the buildings, and so we can really show with all the transparency what we are doing with that money we take from the carbon tax. I think that is something that in our country, until now, it works, and we try to go on that further. But as I mentioned, we will have a higher CO2 tax now in the next decade if we have not attained our goals. And so it's on the one hand, if we achieve our target, then it's fine. If we do not achieve, the tax will be higher than before.
Minister Haavisto, would you also say that that is the way to bring people along, concrete benchmarking to show them where the money's going, plus rebates and dividends, or do you try a different approach?
I think it's very Important to say that while we are putting taxes on carbon and energy and so forth, we can actually have a less taxation on work and so forth, so that we are changing whole system of taxation. And I think it's very typical for the new environmental legislation and environmental taxes that there's first this kind of opposition who says that the economy is going to collapse and this is a disaster. I participated to the Kyoto climate conference as an environmental minister, and everybody said that Kyoto minus 8% is a disaster, economies will collapse. Of course, first of all, it wasn't enough for the environment, and secondly, economies can adapt themselves to these environmental realities. And I think this has to be the rule, of course. And actually, economies can also benefit of the new markets that are created by environmental friendly energy production and so forth. We have a boost on green energy and green investments at the moment, and I think this is the way to go forward, and this gives some hope also to people that we are changing our system, but this is creating new jobs, new possibilities for the economy, and new growth.
Thank you very much. So we're just about out of time, but let me ask everybody as a final statement of sorts to complete this sentence. So the beginning of the sentence is, by 2030, carbon pricing will be ... And I'm going to go to Sabine Frank, first of all, to just complete that sentence. Just one phrase. By 2030, carbon pricing will be...
A much more popular policy across the world, but always in combination with other policy measures such as mandating emission limitations and phasing out fossil fuels.
Thank you. Wendy Hughes, how would you complete that sentence?
I would say by 2030 that carbon pricing will be playing a very significant role in most countries' transitions toward sustainability.
Thank you very much. Councillor Sommaruga, how would you complete the sentence?
Well, I would say that by 2030, carbon taxes will be a well-established, successful policy.
A lot of optimists on our panel. Minister Haavisto?
By 2030, carbon taxes will be a global rule.
Okay, well, let's carry that banner forward. Thank you very much to all of you for your participation in this very thought-provoking, very interesting panel on carbon pricing, a policy whose time hopefully is now coming.